On this day, 8th of February, 1904, the Japanese attack the Russians at Port Arthur. This attack, seen by many as a prelude to the attack on Pearl Harbor 40 years later. This attack instigated the Russo-Japanese War to be a great victory for the rising Imperial Japanese and a body blow for the Russian Empire. Many see this war as being the beginning of the fall of the Russian Tsar and his autocracy in Russia. On this day, this began. Ever since the Meiji Revolution in the 1860s and the Americans forcing Japan to open up to the world and to specifically its trade, Japan had been on a modernizing crusade to make itself impervious to Western imperialism. In fact, what they wanted was to be an empire in their own right. But they had come late to the game, and instead of finding vast, relatively empty territories that could be developed and made into their own, they didn't find that much. They had the Kuril Islands, they had Hokkaido to the north, a few islands near Okinawa down south that they could make Japanese relatively easily. But the only places where they could expand into were already taken. Some were the cradles of ancient civilizations: Korea, China, Vietnam, and to the north, Siberian territories of the Russian Empire. It was going to be a hard nut to crack. Japanese were going to try. In 1894-5, Japanese had fought and won a war against the Chinese. In that, they had taken Korea away from them. It was no longer Chinese fief, it would now be a Japanese fief. The Emperor of Korea would be responsible towards the Japanese emperor. And eventually, in 1905, Koreans and Korea would become a part of Japan itself. Also in 1895, Taiwan was taken from China. As you know, if you've listened to other videos of mine, Taiwan had only been Chinese since the 1680s-ish. So it had not been Chinese for that long if you look at history. And so the Japanese took that and were very busy making it Japanese as well. And they probably would have if they had not lost the war in 1945. The one big nut to crack would be China, something that would eventually they would break them. But at this point, China was weak. It was failing, it was crumbling. And various Western powers were coming in to take what they could. The British had already taken Hong Kong back in the 1840s. The Portuguese had something in Macau for hundreds of years. The French had territories and concessions. The Russians had Port Arthur, which was a very nice warm water port in the Pacific. The Russians also had a lot of influence in Manchuria and in Korea. So the Japanese were kind of sharing influence in Korea, but they wanted Manchuria. The Russians also had Mongolia and East Turkestan. The British were influential in Tibet. China was falling apart and the Japanese wanted some of that action. In 1900, during the Boxer Rebellion, the Japanese had joined the Americans, British, the Indians, the Russians, the Germans, the Austrians, the French, the Italians, and everyone else who went along in crushing the Boxer Rebellion. In many ways, the Boxer Rebellion could probably be compared to ISIS of the day. A bunch of crazies who were attacking foreigners and destroying things like telegraph poles and digging up railways. They're very much against any sort of modernity, and they saw anything Western, including Chinese Christians, as being examples of that. So Japan was on the winning side. They were the good Asians. They were the good guys. You could work with them. In 1904, the Japanese, they had decided on a course of action. That course of action going up against a major European power. It was a gamble. It was one that they believed that if they won, they would become a great power in their own right. The Russians had been expanding east of the Urals for hundreds of years at this point. They needed and wanted a warm water port on the Pacific Ocean, and Port Arthur was their warm water port. Vladivostok only remains ice-free during the summer. One of the great pities of Russia, always trying to look for a port that remains ice-free and open to the ocean, and they've never been able to find it. That's why Russia's never really been a successful maritime power. The Japanese, on the other hand, wanted Korea, and they were willing to make a deal with the Russians. They would recognize Russian sphere of influence in Manchuria if they could have all of Korea. The Russians said, well, we'll have half of Korea. So again, this kind of reflects what happened 50 years later after the Russians occupied North Korea. But they wanted Northern Korea, and the Japanese could have the southern part. The Japanese didn't like this because they wanted to expand their influence into mainland Asia, and having only a small part of the Korean peninsula did not satisfy them. They saw this as a threat, and they decided to take action. So, on the 9th of the 8th, going into the 9th of February, 1904, Japanese attacked the Russian Eastern Fleet at Port Arthur in modern-day China. Now, the attack wasn't actually terribly successful. The Japanese had got some intelligence that actually wasn't true, saying that Russians were on full alert for any attack, and they weren't. The officers were having a drunken party at the time, and the Japanese could have gone in and destroyed the entire fleet. Instead, they made a bit of a cock-up of it. They damaged some of their own ships and lost 90 of their own men in the fight with the Russians. The Russians didn't lose any ships, and so the attack was in many ways a failure. But it did open the war. It did start the war. And in the days and weeks directly after this attack on Port Arthur, Japanese would successfully destroy Russian armies and destroy their fleet eventually. The war would be a disaster for Russia. It would be the first time that a major European power had been defeated by a non-European power in such a way in a very long time. There had been minor defeats, tactical defeats and little battles here and there, but not a war like this. Japan proved that its modernization had worked. It also proved that it was now a world power. This would eventually lead to the British coming to an agreement with the Japanese. Basically, the Japanese would be the junior partner in the Pacific, and that they would be in alliance with the British, and they would honour that agreement in the First World War, not so much in the Second, though. The attack on Port Arthur is seen by many, along with the British attack on Taranto in 1940, as the blueprint for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Surprise attacks like this were something that the Japanese seemed to like doing. The Japanese would end taking all of Korea. They would take Port Arthur, and their influence in Manchuria would grow. And eventually, this would lead to their invasion of Manchuria and setting up a puppet state of Manchukuo. In Russia, the 1905 revolution led to the opening of a Duma and the Tsar granting constitution and some limited power to this new government, although he would go back on it as soon as he could. But it was a complete disaster, and it did lead to the beginnings of a delegitimacy for him and his rule. Now, he could have survived this, but the First World War was going to cement his fate and the fate of Prussia. So that is the attack on Port Arthur on this day, 1904. If you like these videos, come back tomorrow for more. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment.